Sometimes the most broken souls find each other in the most forgotten places. When everything you've known crumbles away, even the companionship of a scarred wolf can feel like a gift from the old gods. Runa never expected to inherit anything from her uncle, except memories and regret. The longhall stood empty for years, its timber walls weathered grey by coastal storms, its hearth cold as winter stone. At 53, with battle scars marking her hands and silver threading her braids, she wanted nothing more than shelter and silence. The wolf appeared on her second day there. Battle-worn like herself, it watched from the tree line with amber eyes that seemed to understand loss. Neither feared the other, perhaps recognizing kindred spirits who had survived when others had not. But when the wolf began digging frantically beneath the old hearthstones, clawing at earth that hadn't been disturbed in decades, Runa discovered her inheritance was far more than rotting timber and fading memories. Buried gold gleamed in the firelight, more wealth than most Vikings saw in a lifetime. What secret had her uncle taken to his grave, and why was this lone wolf so determined to unearth it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through gaps in the sagging roof, casting dancing shadows across the dust-covered floor of Magnus's longhall. Runa stood in the doorway, her calloused fingers wrapped around the iron key that had brought her here, the only thing her uncle had left her besides this crumbling sanctuary at the edge of the world. She had walked for 3 days to reach this place, following coastal paths she hadn't traveled since childhood. The salt wind carried memories she thought she'd buried deeper than any treasure. Summers spent here as a girl, listening to Magnus tell stories of distant lands, while the fire crackled and her parents spoke in hushed tones about raids and glory. Those were different times, when the world seemed larger and full of possibility. Before plague and sorrow had taught her that some prices were too high to pay. The long hall stretched before her, 40 paces from door to back wall, its timber frame still solid despite years of neglect. Cobwebs draped the carved pillars like funeral shrouds, and mice had made nests in the rotting thatch, but the bones of the structure remained strong. Magnus had built well, as all their family did, meant to last, meant to shelter generations that would never come. Runa stepped inside, her leather boots echoing against the stone hearth that dominated the hall's center. This was where she'd seen the wolf digging, where gold had caught the firelight like captured stars. But in daylight, with no flames dancing across the walls, the magic felt distant. Only the disturbed earth remained, dark soil scattered across ancient stones that had warmed countless meals and heard countless stories. She walked the hall's length, taking inventory of what remained. Magnus had lived simply in his final years, a sleeping alcove with a straw mattress grown mouldy, a few wooden bowls and cups, clothes that moths had claimed. But tucked behind the high seat, wrapped in oiled leather, she found something that made her breath catch, a drinking horn carved with intricate runes, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. Runa lifted the horn to the light streaming through the roof holes. The runes were old, older than Magnus himself, but fresh scratches marred the ancient patterns. Someone had added new markings recently, crude symbols that looked like navigation marks, the kind sailors used to record dangerous passages or significant landmarks. "What were you up to, old man?" she whispered, tracing the fresh cuts with her fingertip. Magnus had been her father's younger brother, born when the great raiding age was already fading into memory. While other men spoke of Vinland and the western lands with the reverence reserved for legends, Magnus had always talked as if he'd seen those shores himself. As a child, Runa had assumed it was storytelling, the way old men embellished truth to make better tales. Now, holding this marked horn, she wondered if her uncle had kept secrets deeper than his quiet nature suggested. She set the horn aside and continued searching. In a corner chest beneath moth-eaten wool, she found more treasures, silver coins from lands she couldn't identify, a small knife with a bone handle carved in the shape of a wolf's head, and wrapped in silk that seemed impossibly fine for this remote place. A collection of glass beads that caught the light like drops of coloured fire. These weren't the possessions of a simple fjord farmer. Magnus had told everyone he'd never travelled beyond the next valley, claimed he preferred his own hearth to any adventure. Yet here was evidence of journeys to places where such exotic goods might be found, or traded from those who had made such journeys. Runa sat heavily on the edge of the sleeping platform, suddenly feeling every one of her 53 years. She had come here seeking only shelter, a place to quietly tend her remaining days, away from the curious eyes and pitying words of those who remembered her former self. 20 years ago, she had been Runa Ironhand, shield maiden of considerable reputation, wife to a prosperous trader, mother to twin boys who had inherited their father's bright eyes and their mother's stubborn chin. The plague had taken them all within a single terrible winter. First the boys, their small bodies unable to fight the fever that swept through their settlement like wildfire. Then Bjorn, her husband, who had held their sons as they died and seemed to will his own death from grief. Runa had survived as she always did, but survival felt more like punishment than gift. She had tried to continue trading, but the roots Bjorn had established required trust that died with him. She had tried to remain in their home, but every corner held ghosts she couldn't bear to face. Finally, she had taken what she could carry and walked away from the life she'd built, becoming a wanderer who hired her sword to merchants and farmers who needed protection but asked few questions about her past. The work had been honest enough, and it kept her moving. Movement meant no time to think, no quiet moments when memory could ambush her with visions of small hands reaching for comfort she couldn't provide. But the years had worn her down like water on stone, and when Magnus's message had found her carried by a merchant she'd once guarded, she had felt something, like relief at the prospect of a place to rest. She hadn't expected to find mysteries buried beneath the hearthstones. She hadn't expected a wolf companion either. The thought made her look toward the door, where morning light still slanted across the threshold. The wolf hadn't appeared today, but she felt its presence like a weight in the air, a sense of being observed. Yesterday, after the initial shock of discovery, she had spent hours watching the creature dig. It worked with purpose, not the random scratching of an animal seeking food, but the focused effort of something that knew exactly what it was looking for. When she had approached with a torch to better see what it had uncovered, the wolf hadn't fled. Instead, it had stepped back and watched her examine the gold, arm ring with eyes that seemed almost expectant, as if it had been waiting for her to find what it had revealed. Runa had seen enough strange things in her life to know that some mysteries demanded respect rather than rational explanation. In the northern lands, where winter nights stretched long, and the line between world and otherworld grew thin, wise people learned to accept that some things simply were. Without needing to understand why, she rose and walked back to the hearth, kneeling where the wolf had dug. The arm ring still lay where she'd left it, heavy gold worked with patterns she didn't recognize. The craftsmanship was exceptional, better than most pieces she'd seen, even in wealthy households. But more importantly, it didn't look Norse. The patterns were too flowing, too organic, lacking the angular geometry her people favored. This suggested trade with distant peoples, or perhaps she lifted the ring to examine it more closely in the strengthening daylight. Or perhaps it suggested travel to those distant lands, bringing back treasures that couldn't be explained without admitting to journeys that were supposed to be impossible. Magnus had been nearly 60 when he died, old enough to have been a young man during the final great expeditions to the western lands. The ones that had returned with stories of vast forests, wild natives, and riches beyond imagining. The ones that had also returned with tales of ship-killing storms, deadly diseases, and winters that claimed more lives than any war. Most of those expeditions had ended in disaster. Ships were lost, crews decimated, dreams of permanent settlement abandoned as impractical. But some had returned, and some had brought wealth that couldn't be explained by ordinary raiding or trading. Runa turned the arm ring over in her hands, noting how the weight felt familiar despite its foreign design. Good gold was good gold, regardless of who shaped it. But where had Magnus gotten it? And why bury it beneath his own hearth like a shameful secret? The sound of footsteps on the path outside made her quickly pocket the ring. She wasn't ready to share her discoveries with whatever neighbor had come to investigate the smoke from yesterday's fire. Standing, she brushed dirt from her hands and walked to the door. Squinting against the brightening sky, a figure approached along the coastal path. An old man, bent with age, but moving with the steady gait of someone accustomed to long walks. As he drew closer, Runa recognized Bjorn the Elder, who had farmed the next valley over for as long as anyone could remember. She had played with his grandchildren during those childhood summers, back when the world seemed safer and full of endless possibilities. "Runa Magnus' daughter," he called out, raising a gnarled hand in greeting. "I heard you had come to claim old Magnus's holding." She nodded, stepping outside to meet him halfway. "The hall needs work, but the bones are still strong." "Aye. Magnus built well." Bjorn's eyes were sharp despite his years, and they swept the longhall's exterior with the assessing gaze of someone who understood construction. "Strange man, your uncle. Friendly enough when you met him on the paths, but he kept to himself more than most. Some said he was hiding from something. What kind of something?" The old man shrugged. "The past has long teeth, they say. Most of us carry burdens we'd rather not share." His gaze settled on her face with uncomfortable perception. "I heard about your troubles, girl. I'm sorry for your losses." Runa felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with unwanted sympathy. "Thank you. Will you stay long?" It was a practical question, the kind neighbors asked when they needed to know whether to extend friendship or simply politeness. Runa found herself considering it seriously for the first time since arriving. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I have nowhere else that calls to me." Bjorn nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Well, if you need anything, tools, advice, company, you know where to find me. Magnus was good to my family over the years. I'd be honored to extend that friendship to his kin." After he left, continuing on his morning walk to check his fishing nets, Runa stood in the doorway watching the sun climb higher over the fjord. The day was warming, promising good weather for the repairs the hall desperately needed. She had money saved from her years of guard work, enough to buy supplies and perhaps hire help if the work proved beyond her aging strength. But first, she needed to understand what else might be buried beneath her new home. The wolf's digging had revealed one treasure, but something told her it hadn't revealed all of them. Magnus's secrets were still waiting to be uncovered, and until she knew what they were, she couldn't decide whether this place would become her sanctuary or her trap. The wolf returned with the evening mist, materializing from the grey twilight like a spirit-given form. Runa had spent the day clearing debris from the hall and patching the worst holes in the roof with oiled leather, honest work that kept her hands busy and her mind from dwelling on mysteries. But when she stepped outside to draw water from the well, there it was, sitting precisely where it had been the day before. Ember eyes fixed on the longhall's entrance, this time, and she was ready for it, "So," she said conversationally, setting down her water bucket. "You've come back to finish what you started." The wolf's ears pricked forward, and for a moment she could have sworn it nodded. Then it rose and padded directly to the hearth, where it began digging again with renewed intensity. Claws scraped against stone, and earth flew in, steady showers as the creature worked with the focused determination of something that knew exactly what lay buried. Beneath, Runa lit a torch and knelt, beside the excavation, watching carefully. Yesterday's discovery had been barely 2 handspans down, but the wolf was digging deeper now, following some scent or instinct she couldn't perceive. The hole grew larger and deeper until even the wolf had to climb down into it to continue its work. Then, its claws struck something that rang like metal against stone. The wolf whined softly and looked up at her with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. The message was clear. This was as far as it could go alone. Runa fetched a spade from Magnus's meager tool collection and carefully joined the excavation. The wolf stepped back to give her room, but remained close enough to watch every shovelful of earth she removed. Whatever lay buried here was large, much larger than a single arm ring. Her spade struck metal again, and this time she could see what it had found. A wooden chest, iron-bound and barely damaged by its years underground, lay tilted on its side in the pit they had created. The wood was dark with age and moisture, but the craftsmanship was excellent. This wasn't some hastily buried treasure, it was something someone had carefully prepared for long storage. With the wolf's help, the creature seemed to understand that careful paws were better than sharp claws. Now, she managed to work the chest free from the earth that held it. It was heavier than she had expected, requiring all her strength to lift it from the hole and set it beside the hearth. The lock was corroded, but still held. Runa examined it by torchlight, noting the quality of the metalwork and the style of the mechanism. Like the arm ring, this didn't look purely Norse. The decorative elements were too flowing, too organic. Speaking of craftsmanship traditions from somewhere else, she had tools that could break the lock, but something made her hesitate. This chest had been deliberately buried by someone who had gone to considerable trouble to preserve it. Opening it felt like crossing a threshold she couldn't uncross. The wolf whined again, a soft sound that somehow conveyed urgency. "You think I should open it?" she asked, feeling only slightly foolish for speaking to the creature as if it could understand. This time there was no mistaking the nod. Runa fetched a chisel and hammer from Magnus's tools. The lock was old but well made, and it took several careful strikes to break it without damaging whatever might be inside. When the mechanism finally gave way with a rusty snap, she found herself holding her breath. The lid opened smoothly on well-oiled hinges, revealing contents that made her gasp in genuine amazement. Gold filled the chest, not just a few pieces like the arm ring, but more wealth than she had ever seen in one place. Arm rings and necktalks glowed in the torchlight alongside coins from a dozen different lands. Silver gleamed beside the gold, intricate brooches and pins worked with designs she didn't recognize. And scattered among the precious metals were other treasures, carved ivory pieces that might have been game counters, ember beads the size of plums, and wrapped in silk that had somehow survived the years underground. A collection of gems that caught the firelight like captured stars, but what truly caught her attention was what lay beneath the treasure. Carefully preserved in oiled leather wrapping, she found a collection of objects that told a story she was only beginning to understand. A ship's compass, its bronze face cracked but still readable, navigation tools of the kind used for long ocean voyages, and most telling of all, a collection of carved ivory pieces that were definitely not Norse, small, figurines of animals and people rendered in a style that spoke of distant lands and foreign hands. These weren't the contents of a successful trading expedition. This was too much wealth, too carefully preserved, and too deliberately hidden. This looked like the gathered treasures of a group of people who had known they were going to die and had desperately tried to preserve something of their journey for those who might come after. The wolf moved closer, pressing its warm flank against her side as she knelt beside the open chest. The gesture was oddly comforting, as if the creature understood the weight of what she had discovered. Runa lifted one of the ivory carvings, a small figure of a man in robes that definitely weren't Norse clothing. The style was unlike anything she had seen, and the skill required to create such detail in such hard material suggested craftsmen of considerable ability. This wasn't something that could be found in any northern market. This was something that had come from very far away indeed. As she examined the carving, memory stirred, fragments of stories Magnus had told during those childhood summers. Tales of expeditions to lands beyond the Western Sea, where strange peoples built in stone and worked miracles with growing things. Stories of crews who had found riches beyond imagining, but had paid terrible prices to claim them. She had assumed they were just stories, the kind of tales old men told to entertain children on long winter nights. But holding this foreign carving in her hands, surrounded by treasure that clearly came from someplace far beyond the familiar waters of the fjords, She began to wonder if Magnus's stories had contained more truth than anyone realized. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall through the holes in the roof. Runa quickly began repacking the treasure, wrapping each piece carefully before placing it back in the chest. Whatever this represented, it was too valuable to leave exposed to the elements. As she worked, her mind raced with implications. If this treasure was what she suspected, the carefully preserved wealth of an expedition that had gone terribly wrong, then its presence here meant Magnus had been involved in something far more significant than anyone knew. The question was whether he had been a participant in the expedition or simply someone who had found what they left behind. The wolf watched her work with patient eyes, and she found herself wondering about its role in all this. Wild animals didn't normally show such focused interest in buried treasure, and they certainly didn't seem to understand the significance of human artifacts. Yet this creature had led her directly to discoveries that were clearly important. "What did you know, old friend?" she murmured, securing the chest's lid. "And what else are you planning to show me?" The storm was strengthening now, rain beginning to fall in earnest through the damaged roof. Runa dragged the chest to the driest corner of the hall and covered it with oiled leather from her pack. The wolf followed her movements attentively, seeming as concerned with protecting the treasure as she was. As she prepared to settle in for the night, Runa realized that everything had changed. This morning she had been a tired warrior seeking only shelter and solitude. Now she was the guardian of a secret that could attract attention she definitely didn't want. Treasure like this would draw men from considerable distances if word got out, and not all of them would be interested in honest negotiation for a fair share. She checked her weapons, sword, long knife, and the small axe she carried for practical work. They were well maintained and sharp, but she hadn't used them in anger for several years. Still, some skills were like swimming. Once learned, they stayed with you even when you hoped you'd never need them again. The wolf curled up near the hearth, positioning itself between her and the door. Its presence was reassuring in ways she hadn't expected. Whatever else it might be, it was clearly on her side in protecting what they had found. Outside, the storm built to full fury, wind howling around the longhall's walls and rain drumming against the patched roof. Inside, Runa lay on her sleeping furs and stared at the dancing shadows cast by the dying fire. She had come here seeking an ending, a quiet place to spend her remaining years in peace. Instead, she had found the beginning of something she didn't yet understand, but which promised to test every skill she had learned in her long and eventful life. Dawn broke grey and wet, the storm having passed, but leaving the world soaked and dripping. Runa woke to find the wolf already alert, ears pricked toward sounds she couldn't yet hear. Years of dangerous living had taught her to trust such warnings. So she rose quietly and reached for her sword. The sound that had alarmed her companion became clear as she listened. Hoofbeats on the coastal path, moving at the steady pace of travelers rather than the urgent rhythm of messengers or raiders. Still, visitors this early suggested purpose beyond casual neighborliness. She moved to the door, keeping to shadows as she observed the approaching riders. 3 men on sturdy horses, their clothes marking them as traders rather than warriors, though she noted they wore swords and moved with the alertness of people accustomed to danger. The lead rider was a man she didn't recognize, middle-aged, well-fed, with the calculating eyes of someone who made his living finding profit in other people's circumstances. "Good morning," he called out as they approached, raising a hand in greeting that seemed friendly enough, but somehow felt like a claim of territory. "I am Einar Thorson, trader from the south. We heard someone had taken residence in Magnus's old hall." Runa stepped into the doorway, but kept one hand near her weapon. "I am Runa, Magnus's niece. The hall is mine by right of inheritance." Of course. Einar's smile was too practiced to be genuine. "We mean no challenge to your claim. We simply heard there might be activity here again, and we thought to introduce ourselves. Trade benefits everyone after all." His companions spread slightly to either side, not threatening exactly, but positioning themselves to have clear views of the hall and its surroundings. Runa recognized the formation. These were men accustomed to evaluating opportunities and threats simultaneously. "What kind of trade?" she asked. "Oh, the usual things. We deal in quality goods from distant lands, items that might not be available through ordinary channels." His eyes swept the longhall's exterior with professional assessment. "Sometimes we encounter people who have unusual items they might wish to exchange for more practical goods." The wolf emerged from behind her, taking a position where it could see all three visitors clearly. Its posture was alert but not yet aggressive, a watchful guardian rather than an immediate threat. Einar's eyes fixed on the creature with obvious surprise. "Interesting companion you have there. Not many people keep wolves as pets." "He's not a pet," Runa said simply. "He belongs to this place." Something in her tone must have conveyed that the subject wasn't open for discussion, because Einar's smile became slightly more forced. "Well, we don't want to intrude on your morning. Perhaps we could return another time when you've had a chance to settle in. Sometimes people discover they have more to trade than they initially realized." After they left, riding back down the coastal path at the same measured pace, Runa stood in her doorway, considering implications. Word was already spreading that Magnus's hall was occupied again, and it was attracting exactly the kind of attention she had hoped to avoid. Traders like Einar didn't make social calls on isolated holdings unless they suspected profit, and his questions had been too pointed to be casual curiosity. The wolf pressed against her leg, a warm weight that somehow conveyed both comfort and shared concern. Whatever instincts had led it to dig up the treasure chest, they apparently extended to recognizing potential threats to their discovery. "They suspect something, don't they?" she murmured to her companion. "The question is whether they know something specific or they're just fishing." She spent the morning continuing repairs on the hall while thinking through her options. The smart thing would be to rebury the treasure and pretend ignorance if anyone asked direct questions. But something about the careful way it had been preserved suggested that wouldn't be enough. If Magnus had been part of an expedition that had gone wrong, there might be records somewhere, maps or logs, that would lead others to this exact spot. The wolf seemed to have its own agenda. While she worked on patching roof holes, it began digging again, not at the original site, but in a new location near the back wall of the hall. This time, its excavations revealed something different, a leather satchel wrapped in oiled cloth, the kind scribes used to preserve important documents. Inside, she found what she had been both hoping for and dreading: Magnus's personal records of what could only be described as the most ambitious and disastrous expedition in Norse history. The documents were written in Magnus's careful hand, supplemented with rough maps and navigational notes. As she read by the improved light of her repaired windows, a story emerged that explained both the treasure and her uncle's lifelong reticence about his travels. 23 years ago, Magnus had served as navigator on a secret expedition financed by wealthy merchants from 3 different settlements. Their goal had been to establish a permanent trading post in the rich lands beyond the Western Sea, the place some called Vinland, where previous expeditions had reported abundant timber, fertile soil, and natives willing to trade valuable furs for metal goods. The expedition had started promisingly. 47 men in 2 well-built ships, carrying enough supplies for 2 years, and trade goods worth more than most jarls saw in a lifetime. Magnus's navigation had been flawless, bringing them to landfall exactly where they had planned, in a sheltered bay that offered fresh water and defensible high ground for their intended settlement. But the local inhabitants had been less welcoming than previous expeditions had suggested. What started as successful trading relationships had gradually soured as the Norse made it clear they intended to stay permanently. Small raids became open warfare, and the would-be settlers found themselves besieged in a hastily constructed fort that was never meant to withstand sustained attack. The decision to abandon the settlement had come after the first ship was burned during a night attack that claimed 18 lives. The survivors had loaded everything valuable they could carry onto the remaining vessel and attempted to return home. But storms and sickness had taken more lives during the return voyage, and when they finally reached familiar waters, only 12 men remained alive. Magnus's log detailed the survivors' desperate decision to bury most of their collected wealth rather than try to explain how such riches had been acquired by an expedition that was officially supposed to have been a simple trading voyage. The participants had sworn oaths to keep the true scope of their losses secret, agreeing that the dead deserved better than to be remembered as failures. Magnus had been chosen to hide the main treasure hoard because his holding was remote and he had no family likely to ask uncomfortable questions. The other survivors had taken small portions to support their stories of limited trading success, then had gradually dispersed to different settlements where their accounts of the expedition's moderate results wouldn't be compared too closely. The satchel also contained something else. Detailed maps showing not just where the treasure was buried, but also the locations of supply caches they had established along their route, and most importantly, the exact position of their attempted settlement in the western lands. Runa stared at the maps, understanding finally why Magnus had seemed so burdened in his later years. He hadn't just been keeping a secret about treasure. He had been the sole guardian of geographical knowledge that could make someone incredibly wealthy. If they were willing to risk the dangers that had destroyed the original expedition, the wolf watched her read with patient attention, and she found herself wondering again about its connection to these events. Had Magnus raised its parents or grandparents as guardians for the burial site? The timing would work, and it would explain the creature's seemingly supernatural knowledge of where things were hidden. As she carefully repacked the documents, Runa realized her situation had become far more complicated than she had imagined. The treasure was valuable enough to attract dangerous attention, but the knowledge of where it came from might be even more valuable to the right people. And if traders like Einar were already sniffing around, it was only a matter of time before others arrived with less subtle approaches to acquiring what she had found. She looked at her elderly hands, marked with scars from old battles, and wondered if they still remembered enough of fighting to protect what Magnus had left in her care. The ship's log made for grim reading by firelight. Magnus had written with the careful precision of a man who knew his words might be the only testimony to his companion's courage. And as Runa read deeper into the account, the full tragedy of the Western expedition began to emerge. The final entries detailed the survivors' desperate flight homeward, their remaining ship overloaded with treasure they could barely justify possessing. Storm after storm had battered them, and the sickness that claimed half their remaining crew had symptoms Magnus described with the clinical detachment of someone who expected to succumb himself. Olaf died in the night, read one entry. We wrapped him in his cloak and gave him to the waves with what ceremony we could manage. The fever takes them quickly now, but not quickly enough. Harold speaks of cursed gold, but I think our curse is simpler. We took too much from people who had too little to spare, and the sea judges us accordingly. The last entry was written in a shaking hand, dated just days before they would have reached the Norse settlements. We are 12 now, down from 47. If we survive to make landfall, we have agreed to bury the greater part of what we carry. Let the dead keep their treasures. Those of us who live will carry lighter loads and heavier consciences. Runa set down the log and rubbed her tired eyes. No wonder Magnus had been a quiet man who kept to himself. He had spent decades carrying the weight of 35 friends' deaths, knowing that their families believed them lost to ordinary storm or sickness, rather than a doomed quest for riches that had cost far more than it could ever be worth. The sound of approaching footsteps drew her attention to the door. This time her visitor was alone and familiar. Bjorn, the elder, moving with the careful gait of someone navigating rough ground in failing light. "Good evening, Runa," he called out. "I hope you don't mind an old man checking on a neighbor." She welcomed him inside, grateful for honest company after hours of reading about treachery and death. The wolf acknowledged Bjorn with a polite nod, another sign of its unusual intelligence, before settling back into its watchful position near the hearth. "I see you've made good progress with the repairs," Bjorn observed, looking around the hall with approval. Magnus would be pleased to see his home cared for again. "It's good work," Runa agreed. "Keeps the hands busy and the mind focused." Bjorn's sharp eyes noted the documents spread on the table, though he was too polite to comment directly. Instead, he settled onto the bench across from her and accepted the cup of ale she offered. "I had visitors earlier today," she said carefully. "Traders from the south, asking about opportunities for business." The old man's expression darkened slightly. "Einar Thorson and his men, I'd wager. They've been asking questions in the village too. Curious about what Magnus might have left behind, what you might have found while cleaning out the hall." "What kind of questions?" "The expensive kind. Whether anyone had seen unusual items, whether Magnus had ever spoken of travels beyond the local areas, whether there might be reason to think this holding contained more than it appeared to." Bjorn took a careful sip of ale before continuing. "There's something you should know, Runa. These aren't the first strangers to ask such questions. Magnus had visitors like them from time to time over the years, people who seemed to think he might have information or possessions they were interested in acquiring." Runa felt ice form in her stomach. "What did he tell them?" "Nothing useful, as far as anyone could tell. Magnus was always polite, but claimed ignorance of anything that might interest travelers from distant places. But there were those who suspected he was being deliberately unhelpful." Bjorn's eyes met hers directly. "There was talk from time to time that your uncle might have been involved in something significant during his younger years. Something he preferred not to discuss." The wolf raised its head, ears pricking toward sounds outside that human ears couldn't yet detect. Both Runa and Bjorn fell silent, listening for whatever had caught the creature's attention. Hoofbeats again, but moving differently this time. Multiple riders approaching at speed rather than the measured pace of casual travelers. The wolf rose and moved to the door, its posture shifting from alert to ready. "Expecting more visitors?" Bjorn asked quietly. Runa shook her head, reaching for her sword. "But I think I know who they are." The riders appeared in the doorway's frame, 6 men this time, better armed than the morning's traders, and carrying themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to taking what they wanted. Einar Thorson led them, but his earlier facade of polite commerce had been replaced by something considerably more direct. "Runa Magnusdottir," he called out, remaining mounted while his companions began to spread in a loose circle around the longhall. "We've had interesting conversations in the village today. It seems your Uncle Magnus was a man with secrets worth exploring." "My uncle was a farmer who minded his own business," Runa replied, stepping into the doorway with her sword visible but not yet drawn. "As do I. I'm sure you do. But sometimes a person's business becomes more complicated when they inherit things they don't fully understand." Einar's smile had no warmth in it. "We've learned that Magnus received visitors over the years, people looking for information about certain historical events. Events that might have left valuable items in unexpected places." Bjorn appeared beside her, carrying a long knife that looked well-maintained despite his age. "Evening, Einar. You're riding late and in company that suggests business rather than social calls." "Indeed. Business that concerns arrangements Magnus made many years ago. Arrangements that his death may have complicated." Einar's eyes swept the longhall's exterior with obvious calculation. "We believe there may be items here that legally belong to other parties. Items that Magnus was supposed to be safeguarding rather than hoarding." The wolf moved to stand between Runa and the mounted men, its posture making clear that it considered them a threat worth preparing for. Several of the horses shifted nervously at the predator's scent, requiring their riders' attention to keep them steady. "I know nothing of any arrangements," Runa said firmly. "Magnus left me this hall and nothing more. If you have business concerns, you're welcome to present them to the local assembly in proper fashion." Einar laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I'm afraid our business is too urgent for such formalities. We have reason to believe that Magnus preserved certain items that were never his to keep. Items that his partners in a long-ago venture specifically entrusted to him for safekeeping, not permanent possession. Bjorn stepped forward, his old voice carrying the authority of someone who had participated in many assemblies and knew the law. If you have legitimate claims, present them properly. Night visits with armed men suggest intentions that have nothing to do with lawful recovery of property. The law is for people who have time to waste on procedures, one of Einar's companions growled. We know what's buried here. The question is whether she's going to be reasonable about sharing it. Runa felt the familiar coldness that had once served her well in a battle, the clarity that came when talking was finished and action became inevitable. These men hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to take what they believed she possessed, and they would use whatever force proved necessary. I think you should leave, she said quietly, before this becomes something none of us will enjoy explaining to our families. Einar made a gesture to his men, who began dismounting with the coordinated efficiency of people who had done this before. I'm sorry you've chosen to be difficult about this. We really had hoped to handle this as a business transaction. The wolf's growl was low and continuous now, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. In response, similar sounds began to echo from the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. Other voices, other throats answering a call that Runa hadn't heard, but clearly understood. The mounted men's horses began to dance nervously as the scent of multiple predators reached them. Einar fought to control his mount while maintaining his threatening posture, but his confidence was clearly shaken by this unexpected development. Seems you have more allies than we expected, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But wolves or no wolves, we know what Magnus buried, and we know you found it. This can be settled easily or with difficulty, but it will be settled tonight. Runa drew her sword, the familiar weight settling into her hand like greeting an old friend. Beside her, Bjorn readied his knife with movements that spoke of experience despite his years. And around them, amber eyes gleamed in the darkness as Magnus's guardians prepared to defend what had been placed in their care. The confrontation ended not with violence, but with wisdom, as the older wolf pack emerged from the tree line in sufficient numbers to make Einar recalculate the costs of immediate action. Faced with gleaming eyes and low growls from multiple directions, his men remounted their nervous horses and withdrew to a safer distance, but not, Runa noted, beyond sight of the longhall. This isn't finished, Einar called back as they retreated. We know what's here, and we know you can't guard it alone forever. After they disappeared into the night, Bjorn lowered his knife but didn't sheath it. They'll be back, and next time they'll bring more men, or different tactics. Runa nodded, watching the amber eyes fade back into darkness as the wolf pack dispersed to whatever territory they normally claimed. Only her original companion remained, settling beside the door like a sentry taking up his assigned post. I need to understand what I'm truly dealing with, she said, making a decision that felt both inevitable and dangerous. Will you help me? Over the next hour, she shared Magnus's documents with Bjorn, watching the old man's weathered face grow increasingly grave as he read account after account of the doomed Western expedition. When he finished, he set the papers down with hands that trembled slightly from more than age. I remember when they left, he said quietly. Magnus was excited in a way I'd never seen before. He spoke of opportunities to see new lands, to help establish something permanent in places where previous expeditions had found only temporary wealth. Bjorn's eyes were distant with old memory. When he returned alone, months later than expected, he claimed the expedition had failed due to storms and poor planning. No one questioned it. Such things happened often enough. But you suspected differently. Magnus was never the same afterward. Quieter, more careful, as if he was always listening for something approaching from a distance. Bjorn gestured toward the documents. Reading this, I understand why. He was carrying the grief of 35 dead companions and the knowledge that their families would never know the truth about how they died. Runa carefully repacked the papers, her mind working through implications. Einar spoke as if he had legitimate claims to whatever Magnus preserved. Do you think some of the other survivors are still alive? Possible, though unlikely after so many years. But they might have had sons, partners, people who inherited knowledge of what happened along with claims to shares of what was recovered. Bjorn considered this possibility with the practical assessment of someone who had lived long enough to see many family disputes over inheritance. If Magnus was designated as keeper of the main hoard, others might have legitimate expectations of eventual distribution. The wolf raised its head, ears pricking toward new sounds from the coastal path. This time the approach was different, a single person moving on foot, taking care not to make unnecessary noise, but not attempting complete stealth either. Runa moved to the door, sword still in hand, and peered into the darkness. A figure approached from the direction of the village, an elderly woman moving with the careful gait of someone navigating uncertain ground by moonlight. "Astrid?" Bjorn called out, recognizing the newcomer. "What brings you out so late?" The woman who emerged into the firelight was perhaps 70 years old, bent with age but moving with purpose. Her eyes were sharp as she assessed the situation, taking in the drawn weapons and defensive postures. "I saw riders heading this way, and I know Einar Thorson's reputation well enough to be concerned for my neighbors," she said, accepting Runa's offer of assistance up the longhall steps. "I thought you might need someone who remembers more of Magnus's story than most people realize." Astrid settled onto the bench near the fire, declining ale in favor of the herbal tea she carried in her own flask. "Magnus used to visit me from time to time, especially in his final years. He said I was one of the few people old enough to remember when keeping secrets was a matter of survival rather than choice." "What secrets?" Runa asked, though she suspected she already knew. The Western expedition wasn't the only voyage Magnus participated in, though it was the only one that went so badly wrong. Astrid's eyes caught the firelight as she spoke. In his younger days, he served as navigator for several successful trading ventures. He had a gift for reading weather and current that kept ships safe when others might have been lost. She paused to sip her tea, organizing thoughts with the careful precision of someone who had lived long enough to understand which details mattered. "Magnus came to see me 3 days before he died. He was troubled by dreams," he said. "Visions of his dead companions calling to him, demanding to know why their treasures remained buried while their families struggled with ordinary poverty. He spoke of wanting to make amends, but not knowing how to do so without breaking oaths that bound him to silence." Runa felt pieces of understanding click into place. He was planning to reveal the truth. "I think he was planning to find a way to honor both his oaths to the dead and his obligations to the living." Astrid reached into her travel pack and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. "He left this with me, with instructions to give it to whoever inherited his holding, if anyone ever came asking the right questions." The wrapped object proved to be another artifact from the expedition, a silver cross worked in a style that was definitely not Norse. Its surface decorated with symbols and patterns that spoke of Christian craftsmanship from distant lands. "This came from the settlement they tried to establish," Astrid explained. "Magnus said it belonged to a priest who had tried to minister to both the Norse settlers and the local inhabitants. When the fighting started, the priest was among the first casualties, killed while trying to negotiate peace between the two groups." Runa turned the cross over in her hands, noting the quality of the workmanship and the obvious care with which it had been preserved. This wasn't loot taken from defeated enemies. This was a memorial to someone who had died trying to prevent the violence that ultimately doomed the entire expedition. "Magnus kept this as a reminder," Astrid continued, "of the cost of taking things that didn't belong to them, of trying to force permanence in places where they were only meant to be visitors." The wolf moved closer, pressing against Runa's leg in a gesture that had become familiar comfort. Its amber eyes reflected the firelight as it studied the Christian cross with what seemed like recognition. "There's something else you should know," Astrid said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Magnus wasn't the only survivor of the expedition. There was at least one other, someone who returned to the eastern settlements and has spent years trying to locate the buried treasure. Someone who has been hiring people like Einar to search for it. Bjorn leaned forward intently. Who? Eric Bloodaxe's youngest son, Hakon. He was barely 20 when the expedition left, but he was one of its primary financiers. He invested everything his family had in the venture, expecting returns that would make him one of the wealthiest men in the north. Astrid's expression was grim. When the expedition failed, his family lost their fortune and their standing. He spent the last 2 decades rebuilding his wealth through less honorable means, and now he believes recovering the Western treasure is his right by inheritance and investment. The revelation about Hakon changed everything. As Astrid continued her account, painting a picture of a man driven by decades of resentment and financial desperation, Runa began to understand that she was facing something far more dangerous than simple treasure hunters. Hakon has never forgotten or forgiven, Astrid explained, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup for warmth. He believes Magnus and the other survivors cheated him by keeping the expedition's failure secret, denying him the chance to mount rescue efforts or recovery expeditions that might have salvaged something from the disaster. But surely, he must understand the practical reasons for secrecy, Bjorn protested. Admitting to such losses would have ruined everyone involved. Understanding and accepting are different things, especially when a man has spent 20 years watching his family's reputation crumble while knowing that wealth enough to restore their honor lies buried. Somewhere in the northern fjords, Astrid's expression was troubled. Magnus told me that Hakon had approached him several times over the years, sometimes offering partnership, sometimes making threats. Magnus always refused, claiming the treasure was cursed by the blood of those who died acquiring it. The wolf raised its head from where it had been resting, ears pricked toward a sound that seemed to come from deeper in the woods rather than from the coastal path. Its amber eyes fixed on something beyond the circle of firelight, and its body tensed with alert attention. Runa followed the creature's gaze, but saw only darkness beyond the longhall's cleared ground. Still, she had learned to trust the wolf's instincts, and she quietly reached for her sword. "We may not be alone out there," she murmured to her companions, as if summoned by her words. Her bone whistle's clear note echoed from the forest, not the sharp alarm call she might have expected from a human scout, but something deeper, more resonant, almost musical in its complexity. The wolf answered with a howl that seemed to carry layers of meaning she couldn't interpret, and from multiple directions came responding calls. The same pack that had helped deter Einar's men, but this time their voices held different tones, not warning or threat, but something that sounded almost like recognition. "What was that?" Bjorn asked, his hand moving to his knife. Astrid was staring into the darkness with an expression of wonder rather than fear. "Magnus told me stories, but I never quite believed them. He said his family had maintained connections with wolf packs for generations, using them as guardians and messengers in ways that went back to the time of the first settlements." She reached into her pack again and withdrew something that caught the firelight with pale gleam, a bone whistle carved with intricate patterns, and small wolf figures that seemed to dance around its surface. "He gave me this as well, saying it had been passed down through his family line for more generations than anyone could count. He said it was carved from the leg bone of the first wolf to serve his ancestors, and that it could be used to communicate with their descendants." The sounds from the forest were growing closer now, but instead of the menacing approach Runa had feared, what emerged from the tree line was a sight that took her breath away. 5 adult wolves moved into the cleared area around the longhall, not the hunting pack she had expected, but a family group led by a magnificent animal that was clearly the matriarch of the line. The lead wolf approached her companion with careful dignity, the 2 creatures touching noses in what was obviously a formal greeting between relatives. Then the matriarch turned her attention to Runa herself, amber eyes meeting hers with an intelligence that made her feel as if she was being evaluated by an ancient wisdom. "Magnus told me the truth then," Astrid whispered. His family really did maintain the old bonds. The wolf whistle's clear note sounded again, this time from much closer, and a figure stepped from the forest shadows. Not one of Hakon's men, but someone Runa didn't recognize. An elderly man, bent with age but moving with the sure steps of someone who knew these woods intimately. "Evening. Astrid," he said, his voice carrying the careful pronunciation of someone who had spent years speaking to animals as often as to humans. "I heard the call and thought it might be time to pay my respects to Magnus's heir." Astrid rose to greet him with obvious relief. "Runa, this is Ulf Wolfkeeper." He was Magnus's closest friend, and the only other person who knew the full truth about the Western expedition. Ulf approached the longhall with movements that caused no alarm among the assembled wolves. The pack regarded him with the same respect they showed their matriarch, confirming his connection to whatever ancient arrangements governed the relationship between Magnus's family and their four-legged guardians. "Magnus spoke of you often in his final years," Ulf said to Runa, settling beside the fire with the ease of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever wolves were respected. "He hoped you would come to claim your inheritance before others realized what it truly contained." "And what does it truly contain?" Runa asked, though she suspected the answer would be more complex than simple treasure. "Responsibility," Ulf replied without hesitation. "The expedition that failed 23 years ago left behind more than gold and silver. They left behind knowledge, maps of lands that could be reached again, records of what resources might be found there, and most importantly, understanding of what mistakes cost them everything the first time." He gestured toward the assembled wolves, who had arranged themselves in a protective circle around the longhall. "Magnus's family has guarded this knowledge for generations, not because they were greedy, but because they understood that such information in the wrong hands could lead to even greater disasters. The Western lands are rich, but they belong to peoples who will fight to defend them. Any future expeditions would need to approach with respect and partnership, not conquest and exploitation." The implications struck Runa like a physical blow. "The treasure isn't just wealth, it's the key to future expeditions." "Exactly. And that's why Hakon wants it so desperately. He believes that recovering the original investment will allow him to finance a new expedition, one large enough and well-armed enough to succeed where the first one failed. He doesn't understand that success built on violence and theft isn't truly success at all." The wolf matriarch moved closer to Runa, pressing her great head against the woman's hand in a gesture that felt like both blessing and responsibility. The touch was warm and solid, carrying with it a sense of ancient trust being passed from one generation to the next. "Magnus left you more than treasure," Ulf continued quietly. "He left you the choice of what to do with knowledge that could change the northern world, for better or worse, depending on whose hands ultimately control it. The wolves have been waiting to see what kind of guardian you would prove to be." As if in response to his words, the bone whistle sounded once more from the darkness, and additional shapes began emerging from the forest. Not wolves this time, but people, villagers Runa recognized from her childhood visits. Men and women who moved with the quiet confidence of those who had been part of Magnus's secret for many years. Bjorn rose to greet them, his expression mixing relief with concern. "You've come to help?" "We've come to honor old promises," replied a woman Runa remembered as the village's most skilled healer. "Magnus shared his burdens with more people than Hakon realizes. When the time came to choose between old oaths and present dangers, we chose to stand with those who understand the difference between guardianship and greed." The gathering around Magnus's longhall had grown to include a dozen villagers, all moving with the quiet efficiency of people following a long-established plan. As Runa watched them take defensive positions around the property, she began to realize that what she had thought was her private discovery had actually been a community secret, maintained by many hands for over 2 decades. Yolf noticed her confusion and gestured for her to follow him to a quieter corner of the hall. The wolf matriarch padded alongside them, her presence both comforting and somehow formal. as if she too understood that important revelations were about to unfold. "There's something Magnus never put in his written records," Ulf said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something he felt was too dangerous to trust to documents that might be found and misunderstood." He knelt beside the ancient oak tree that stood at the hall's northwestern corner, its massive trunk scarred by decades of coastal storms, but still standing strong. At its base, nearly hidden beneath exposed roots, Runa could see carved runes that looked far older than Magnus's lifetime. This tree was already ancient when Magnus's grandfather first built here, Ulf explained, running weathered fingers along the carved symbols. The runes mark it as a boundary stone, a place where different worlds meet. Magnus chose this location for his hall specifically because of what the tree represented. The wolf matriarch moved to stand beside the oak, her great head tilted upward as if she too could sense whatever significance the tree held. In the moonlight, her amber eyes seemed to glow with reflected starlight. "What kind of worlds?" Runa asked, though she suspected the answer would challenge everything she thought. She understood about her inheritance. Ulf produced a small iron tool from his belt, something between a knife and a chisel, and began carefully working at the base of the oak tree. Within moments, he had revealed a hidden cavity that had been sealed with clay and wax. Inside lay something that made Runa's breath catch in her throat. A runestone unlike any she had ever seen, its surface covered with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering torchlight. But more surprising than its appearance was its message, carved in Magnus's familiar hand, but describing events that contradicted everything she had read in his expedition logs. "The Western expedition wasn't a failure," she read aloud, her voice growing stronger as the implications became clear. "It was a deliberate deception designed to hide the greatest discovery in Norse history." Ulf nodded grimly. "The settlers Magnus wrote about, the ones who supposedly died fighting hostile natives, they never existed. The expedition was successful beyond their wildest dreams. But what they found was so significant that they realized keeping it secret was more important than claiming credit for the discovery." The runestone's message continued in Magnus's careful script, detailing a truth that recontextualized everything Runa thought she knew. The Western lands hadn't been inhabited by scattered tribes of hostile natives. Instead, the Norse expedition had encountered a sophisticated civilization, one that had built permanent settlements, developed advanced agricultural techniques, and most importantly, established trade networks that extended far beyond anything the northern peoples had imagined possible. "They found cities?" Runa asked, hardly believing what she was reading. "Not just cities. They found a people who had solved problems the Norse still struggled with. How to preserve food through extended winters. How to work metal alloys that were stronger than anything their smiths could produce. How to navigate by stars that weren't visible from northern latitudes." Ulf's expression was both proud and troubled. The expedition's members weren't killed by hostile natives. They were invited to stay and learn, to become bridges between two worlds that could benefit enormously from contact with each other. The wolf matriarch whined softly, a sound that somehow conveyed both urgency and warning. Around the longhall, the other wolves had begun to pace restlessly, their attention focused on the coastal path where new sounds suggested approaching riders. "Magnus's companions are still there?" Runa asked, quickly understanding why such a secret would need to be protected at any cost. "Most of them, yes. They established families, learned new skills, became part of communities that welcomed them as equals rather than conquerors. But they all agreed that knowledge of these civilizations had to be carefully controlled. If word spread that such wealth and advanced knowledge were available for the taking, every ambitious jarl and king in the northern lands would launch expeditions that would destroy through violence what could only be preserved through respect. The approaching riders were closer now, and from their numbers and the sound of their horses, this was a force considerably larger than Einar's earlier group. The villagers around the longhall responded with practiced efficiency, taking positions that suggested this confrontation had been anticipated and planned for. "Hakon?" Runa asked, though she already knew the answer. "Almost certainly. Magnus told me that Hakon had been growing more desperate in recent years, hiring increasingly dangerous men to search for traces of the lost expedition. When Magnus died, it was only a matter of time before someone connected his isolated holding with stories of buried treasure. The wolf pack had begun to spread out, not in random patrol patterns, but in what looked like coordinated defensive positions. The matriarch remained beside Runa, but her posture had shifted from greeting to guarding, and her amber eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the cleared ground. Ulf carefully replaced the runestone in its hiding place and sealed the cavity with practiced efficiency. Magnus left detailed instructions for this moment. If Hakon came seeking the expedition's treasure, we were to give him exactly what he expected to find, enough gold and silver to satisfy his greed, but not the knowledge that could lead him to the western settlements. The treasure chest I found, a decoy, valuable enough to be convincing, but containing only a fraction of what the expedition actually recovered. The real treasure isn't gold and silver, it's the maps and records that would allow someone to find the surviving expedition members and the civilizations they've joined. The sound of many horses had resolved into what sounded like at least 20 riders, moving with the confidence of a force that expected no significant resistance. Torchlight flickered between the trees as they approached, and Runa could hear voices calling out challenges and commands. "Where is the real treasure hidden?" she asked urgently. Ulf smiled, an expression that mixed sadness with deep satisfaction. "Oh, you've been guarding it all along. The wolf pack, the villagers who've come to help, the knowledge that's been passed down through generations of careful guardians. We are the real treasure. We are the people who understand that some things are worth more than gold, and that true wealth comes from protecting what should be preserved, rather than claiming what can be taken." The first of Hakon's men appeared at the edge of the cleared ground, their weapons drawn and their intentions clear. But as they took in the scene before them, the assembled villagers, the wolf pack, and the determined woman standing guard over her inheritance, some of them began to show signs of uncertainty. "Runa Magnusdotter," a voice called from among the mounted men. "I am Hakon Eriksson, and I have come to claim what is rightfully mine." Magnus was the keeper of treasure that belongs to the investors in the Western expedition. His death releases those obligations, and that wealth now returns to those who financed its acquisition. Runa stepped forward, her hand resting on her sword hilt, but not yet drawing the weapon. Behind her, the wolf matriarch growled low in her throat, a sound that was echoed by the rest of the pack until the night air thrummed with barely contained menace. "I am Runa, Magnus's heir by right of inheritance," she called back. "If you have legitimate claims to present, you may do so at the proper assembly in the proper fashion. Night raids with armed men suggest intentions that have nothing to do with lawful recovery of property." Hakon pushed his horse forward until he was at the edge of torch range, revealing a man in his 40s whose once handsome features had been hardened by years of disappointment and growing desperation. His clothes were expensive but showed signs of hard travel, and his eyes held the fixed intensity of someone who had staked everything on a single, desperate gamble. "I have no time for assemblies and legal procedures," he snarled. "I know what Magnus buried here, and I know you've found it. The only question is whether you'll be reasonable about sharing it, or whether this needs to become unpleasant for everyone involved." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 20 armed riders facing a handful of villagers, an elderly woman, and a wolf pack that seemed far too organized for wild animals. Runa could feel the weight of decision pressing down on her, not just whether to fight or surrender, but what kind of person she would prove to be when everything she had learned was put to the ultimate test. Hakon's horse stamped nervously as the wolf pack's growling created an undercurrent of menace that even well-trained mounts couldn't ignore. The man himself sat rigid in his saddle, his hand gripping his sword hilt with white-knuckled intensity. "You have one chance to avoid bloodshed," he called out, his voice carrying the edge of someone who had already committed too much to turn back. "Give me what Magnus stole from my family, and I'll leave you in peace to enjoy whatever small portion you believe you're entitled to keep." Runa felt a strange calm settling over her. The same clarity she had once found in battle when the moment came to choose between retreat and commitment. Around her, the villagers stood steady despite being outnumbered, their faces reflecting the same resolution she felt, growing in her own heart. "Magnus stole nothing," she replied, her voice carrying clearly across the cleared ground. "He preserved what others had entrusted to his care, exactly as he promised to do." "Promises to dead men have no legal standing," Hakon snarled. "I invested everything my family possessed in that expedition. When it failed, we lost our lands, our reputation, our future. The treasure Magnus buried represents wealth that should have been returned to the investors who made the venture possible." Ulf stepped forward, his weathered features grave in the torchlight. "The expedition didn't fail, Hakon. It succeeded beyond your wildest dreams, but in ways that your greed prevented you from understanding." The words hit Hakon like physical blows. His horse shied as he jerked on the reins, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and desperate hope. "What do you mean it didn't fail?" Magnus returned alone, with stories of disasters and death. "Magnus returned with the greatest treasure any Norse expedition has ever discovered," Ulf continued relentlessly. "He found peoples who could teach us things we never imagined learning, lands rich enough to support permanent settlements, and most importantly, he found a way to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than conquest and theft." Astrid moved to stand beside Ulf, her voice adding weight to his revelation. "The men who supposedly died in the Western lands are still alive. Hakon, they stayed because they found something worth more than gold. They found a chance to be part of something larger than raiders and traders scrambling for temporary advantage." Runa watched Hakon's expression change as the implications penetrated his desperation-clouded thinking. This wasn't the story of failure and loss he had carried for 20 years. This was a tale of success that had been deliberately hidden from him. "They're still alive," he whispered, and for a moment his voice held wonder instead of rage. "My brother Gunnar, he was part of the crew that stayed to establish the settlement. He married the daughter of a local leader," Ulf said gently. Magnus received word just last year that Gunnar had become grandfather to twin boys who are learning to speak both Norse and their mother's language. He's become a bridge between worlds, helping his new people understand northern ways while learning skills that could transform how we live in these harsh lands. The wolf matriarch chose that moment to pad forward, stopping just at the edge of combat range, but near enough that her massive presence couldn't be ignored. She fixed her amber eyes on Hakon with an intensity that seemed to look directly into his soul, weighing what she found there against standards only she understood. Hakon stared back at the great wolf, and something in his posture began to shift. The desperate rage that had driven him here was being replaced by something more complex: loss, longing, and the terrible realization that he had spent 2 decades hating the wrong people for the wrong reasons. "If they're alive," he said slowly, "if the expedition was successful, why wasn't I told? Why was I allowed to believe they were dead, that my investment was lost?" "Because you would have done exactly what you're doing now," Runa said, and her words carried the authority of someone who had finally understood her true inheritance. "You would have gathered armed men and sailed west to take by force what could only be preserved through patience and wisdom. You would have destroyed in months what took years to build, ruined relationships that benefit everyone for the sake of immediate profit that would benefit only you." The truth of her words struck home, and Hakon's shoulders sagged as 20 years of misdirected anger finally found its proper target, not Magnus or the other survivors, but his own inability to understand that some treasures could only be enjoyed by those who deserved them. Behind him, His hired men were beginning to show signs of unease. They had signed on for a simple treasure recovery, not a complex family dispute involving lost expeditions and ancient secrets. The wolf pack's continued growling was making their horses increasingly difficult to control, and the determination of the defending villagers suggested this would be neither quick nor easy. "There's still time to choose differently," Runa offered, her hand still resting on her sword hilt, but her voice carrying more compassion than threat. Magnus left instructions for this moment. "If you can prove that you understand the difference between guarding and grasping, between preserving and possessing, then there's a place for you in protecting what he built." She gestured toward the longhall, where the oil lamp still flickered in the doorway like a beacon in the darkness. "The real treasure isn't gold and silver that can be spent once and forgotten. It's knowledge that could help our people survive the hard times that are coming. Relationships that could open new possibilities for trade and learning. And most importantly, it's the chance to be remembered as someone who built something lasting rather than someone who grabbed what he could carry." Hakon sat silent on his restless horse, and Runa could see the war being fought behind his eyes. Between the desperation that had driven him here and the growing realization that he had been chasing the wrong treasure for the wrong reasons. "My family's honor," he began, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "Your family's honor was never lost," Astrid interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived long enough to see many reputations rise and fall. "Your brother Gunnar is remembered in the Western lands as a man who helped prevent wars, who taught farming techniques that saved lives during harsh winters, who raised children who will carry the best of both worlds forward into the future. What greater honor could any family claim?" The wolf matriarch took another step forward, and this time Hakon's horse didn't shy away. Instead, the animal seemed to calm under the great wolf's steady gaze, as if recognizing a wisdom that transcended the fears and ambitions of its rider. "The choice is yours," Runa said, drawing her sword but holding it low, making clear that it was ready for use but not yet committed to violence. "You can try to take what you think you're owed, and we'll resist with everything we have. People will die, the treasure you're seeking will likely be destroyed in the fighting, and you'll gain nothing but the satisfaction of revenge against people who were trying to protect something larger than themselves." She paused, letting the weight of that possibility settle over the assembled groups. "Or you can choose to understand what Magnus really left behind, not just wealth, but wisdom. Not just gold, but the chance to be part of something that could benefit your family and ours for generations to come. The knowledge of where Gunnar and the others are, how to reach them safely, how to establish trade relationships that could make us all richer in ways that matter more than silver." Around the clearing, Runa could sense the balance shifting. Some of Hakon's hired men were exchanging glances that suggested they were reconsidering the wisdom of fighting a wolf pack and determined villagers over a family dispute they didn't fully understand. The promise of straightforward treasure hunting had become complicated by questions of honor, legacy, and consequences they hadn't anticipated. Ulf stepped forward, carrying something Runa hadn't seen before, an ancient war shield painted with clan markings that had been weathered by time but remained clearly visible. He held it out toward Hakon with the formal gesture of someone offering a sacred trust. "This was your father's shield," he said simply. "Magnus asked me to preserve it, hoping that someday it could be returned to family hands that would use it to protect rather than plunder, to guard rather than grab." The sight of his father's shield broke something in Hakon's rigid posture. His hand dropped from his sword hilt, and for the first time since arriving, he looked like a man remembering who he had been before. Desperation and disappointment had twisted his purposes. "Father always said that a warrior's greatest victory was the battle he didn't have to fight," he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of long-buried memory. "He would be proud to see his son choose wisdom over wealth," Astrid replied gently. "Magnus never wanted you to suffer for the expedition's success. He wanted you to be worthy of sharing in it when the time was right. The wolf matriarch moved closer still, until she stood almost within reach of Hakon's outstretched hand. Her amber eyes held his gaze with patient intensity, and slowly, carefully, he reached down to touch the great wolf's head. The contact seemed to complete some circuit of understanding that had been building throughout the confrontation. "What would you have me do?" he asked, and his voice held the exhaustion of a man who had carried anger for too long and was finally ready to set it down. Runa felt the tension around the clearing begin to ease as weapons were lowered on both sides. The wolf pack's growling faded to watchful silence, and even the horses seemed to sense that the immediate danger of violence had passed. "Help us protect what Magnus built," she said. "Learn what the real treasure is before deciding whether you want to claim your share of it. And most importantly, prove that you can be trusted with knowledge that could change the northern world for better or worse, depending on whose hands control it." She gestured toward the longhall, where the oil lamp's steady flame continued to offer welcome to anyone willing to enter with peaceful intentions. "Spend the night as our guest. Read Magnus's true records, understand what your brother and his companions accomplished, and then decide whether you want to be remembered as someone who tried to steal from them or someone who helped them complete what they started." Hakon looked around at his assembled men, many of whom were already showing signs of relief that the night might end without bloodshed. The promise of payment for treasure hunting was one thing, but fighting wolves and determined villagers over complex family disputes was quite another. "Stand down," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a fundamental decision. "We'll accept the offer of hospitality and see what truth looks like when it's not filtered through 20 years of anger and assumptions." As the riders began to dismount and the villagers moved to help with their horses, Runa felt the weight of her inheritance settling into its proper place. She wasn't just the guardian of buried treasure. She was the keeper of knowledge that could shape the future of her people, and the protector of relationships that had been built through sacrifice and wisdom, rather than conquest and greed. The wolf matriarch pressed against her side once more, a warm weight that carried approval and recognition. The night's work wasn't finished. There would be difficult conversations ahead, hard choices to make, and tests of character that would determine whether Hakon could truly change from someone who took to someone who gave. But for the first time since arriving at Magnus's longhall, Runa felt that she understood what her uncle had really left her. Not just the burden of keeping secrets, but the opportunity to help others become worthy of sharing them. The longhall filled with an unlikely assembly as former enemies gathered around the central hearth. Hakon sat across from Runa, his father's ancient shield resting against his knee while he read Magnus's true expedition records by firelight. The wolf matriarch had positioned herself between the two groups, her presence serving as both mediator and reminder that some bonds transcended human understanding. As Hakon absorbed the reality of what his brother and the other expedition members had accomplished, his expression shifted through stages of grief, wonder, and something that might have been relief. The companions he had mourned as dead were not only alive but thriving, having found purpose and belonging in ways that simple treasure-seeking could never have provided. Gunnar learned to work with metal alloys that are stronger than anything our smiths can produce, he read aloud, his voice heavy with amazement. He's teaching his new people Norse techniques for preserving fish, while they've shown him how to grow crops that can survive in climates we've never been able to farm. Ulf nodded, settling more comfortably on his bench. Magnus received regular messages through trading networks that extend much farther than most people realize. Your brother hasn't just survived, he's become a leader in building something that could benefit both peoples for generations. The revelation seemed to lift a weight from Hakon's shoulders that he had carried so long he had forgotten how heavy it was. But as he continued reading, new concerns began to replace old grief. If what they've built is so valuable, he said slowly, then others will eventually discover it. Raiders, ambitious jarls, Men who won't care about preserving what exists if they can profit from destroying it. Exactly, Runa replied, recognizing that he was beginning to understand the real challenge. That's why the knowledge has been so carefully guarded. Magnus and the other survivors knew that revealing the Western settlement's location prematurely would doom everything they had worked to build. Astrid leaned forward, her weathered hands clasped around her cup of herbal tea. But keeping secrets forever isn't the answer either. The Western peoples have knowledge that could help us survive the harsh times that are coming. Climate changes, failed harvests, political upheavals. They've learned to adapt to challenges we haven't faced yet. The wolf matriarch raised her great head, ears pricking towards sounds that reached her before human hearing could detect them. Outside, the other wolves were beginning to pace restlessly, their movements suggesting that something had caught their attention. Bjorn moved to the door, peering out into the darkness beyond the firelight. "There are more riders approaching," he reported quietly, moving carefully, trying not to announce their presence. Hakon's expression hardened as he recognized the implications. Einar and his men, they wouldn't have gone far, and they'll have been watching to see what developed here tonight. Through the doorway came the sound of steel being drawn. Not the ring of weapons leaving sheaths, but the whispered scrape of blades being checked and readied for use. Whoever was approaching was doing so with hostile intent, and they were experienced enough to prepare their weapons quietly. "How many men does Einar have?" Runa asked, her own hand moving to her sword hilt. "More than we faced earlier," Hakon replied grimly. "He mentioned having allies in the southern settlements, men who specialize in recovering valuables from people who are reluctant to sell. If he's called them in, we could be facing 30 or more armed fighters." The wolfpack's earlier restraint was giving way to something more primal. Through the walls of the longhall, they could hear the animals spreading out, taking positions that would allow them to attack from multiple directions. The matriarch rose from her place by the fire, her amber eyes reflecting the flames as she moved toward the door. "They'll try to take us by surprise," Ulf said, his voice carrying the calm assessment of someone who had faced such situations before. "Einar knows we have villagers helping us now, but he probably doesn't realize how many or how well prepared they are." Runa felt the familiar cold clarity settling over her thoughts, the battle calm that had served her well in her younger years as a shield maiden. Around the hall, she could see the same transformation taking place in others, Hakon's mercenary instincts awakening, Bjorn's weathered hands finding sure grips on well-maintained weapons, even elderly Astrid producing a long knife from beneath her robes with practiced ease. "We need to make a choice," Runa said, rising to check her weapons one final time. "We can try to negotiate, offer Einar a share of the visible treasure in exchange for peaceful withdrawal. Or we can make clear that some things are worth fighting to protect, regardless of the cost." Hakon stood as well, lifting his father's shield with movements that spoke of muscle memory from training that had never been forgotten. "Einar isn't interested in negotiation. He's invested too much in this venture to accept anything less than complete victory. If we show weakness now, he'll just come back with more men and better preparation." The approaching footsteps were audible now, multiple groups moving with coordinated timing, spreading out to surround the longhall before launching their attack. Through gaps in the repaired roof, they could see shadows moving between the trees, positioning themselves for what would clearly be an assault rather than a negotiation. "Then we make our stand here," Runa decided, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had accepted the full weight of her inheritance. Magnus spent 23 years protecting what his companions built. Tonight, we find out whether we're worthy of continuing that trust. The attack came with the sudden violence of a summer storm, multiple groups striking simultaneously from different directions, while torches blazed beyond the cleared ground like malevolent stars. Einar's voice cut through the night air, no longer bothering with pretense of legitimate business. "Burn them out," he shouted. "The treasure's buried anyway, we'll dig it up from the ashes." Flaming arrows began to arc through the darkness, aimed at the longhall's repaired thatch roof. But the defenders had been ready for such tactics, and buckets of water stood positioned to douse fires before they could spread. More importantly, the wolf pack had positioned itself perfectly to disrupt the coordinated assault. The great matriarch led her family in a charge that scattered the eastern approach, a howl rising above the clash of weapons as she brought down a man who was trying to set fire to the hall's wooden walls. Her pack followed her example, using their superior night vision and knowledge of the terrain to strike where the attackers were most vulnerable. Inside the hall, Runa coordinated the defense with the tactical instincts that had served her well in her shield maiden days. Viking had taken position at the main door, his father's shield catching sword blows, while his own blade found gaps in his opponent's guard. Despite his years of bitterness, he fought with the skill and honor that his father's training had instilled. The back wall. Bjorn called out, pointing toward smoke that was beginning to seep through gaps in the timber. "They're trying to fire us from behind?" Ulf and 2 villagers rushed to deal with the new threat, carrying water and sand to smother flames before they could take hold. But even as they fought one fire, new arrows continued to fall, and it became clear that Einar had come prepared for a siege rather than a simple raid. The wolf matriarch's howl changed pitch, becoming a call that seemed to carry across great distances. From the darkness beyond the immediate battle came answering voices, not just wolves, but human calls as well. The sound sent ice through Runa's veins as she realized what it meant. More of Einar's allies? Hakon asked, parrying a spear thrust while maintaining his defensive position. But the voices that emerged from the forest were calling in the old language, using words that hadn't been heard in these lands for generations. As figures began to appear at the edge of the firelight, Runa saw something that took her breath away. These weren't more of Einar's mercenaries. These were people she had never seen before, men and women whose clothing and weapons spoke of distant lands and different traditions. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of warriors, but their attacks fell upon Einar's men rather than the defenders of the longhall. "Who are they?" Astrid called out, her voice barely audible above the sounds of battle. Ulf's answer came between sword strokes as he fought to protect the hall's most vulnerable corner. Magnus's messages to the western settlements weren't just reports, they were warnings. He told Gunnar and the others that knowledge of their location was becoming harder to protect, that enemies were growing more persistent and dangerous. The implications struck Runa like a physical blow. They've come here. A small group sent to help protect what they helped build. The bonds between the expedition survivors and their new families were strong enough that when Magnus called for help, help came even across an ocean that most people consider impassable. The tide of battle was turning as the newcomers engaged Einar's men with weapons and techniques that the northern fighters had never encountered. Their coordination with the wolf pack was seamless, suggesting that they too had learned to work with animal allies in ways that went beyond ordinary human understanding. Einar himself appeared in the doorway, his sword bloody and his eyes wild with the desperation of someone who had staked everything on success. He faced Runa across the hall's central space, and in his expression she could see the same choice she had faced earlier, whether to cling to old hurts or accept new possibilities. "This ends now," he snarled, raising his weapon with the shaking hands of someone who had already lost but refused to admit it. "I won't be cheated of what I'm owed." But before either of them could move, the wolf matriarch padded between them, her massive presence filling the space with calm authority. Blood matted her fur from the night's fighting, but her amber eyes held steady wisdom as she looked from Einar to Runa and back again. In her jaws, she carried something that gleamed in the firelight, not gold or silver, but something far more precious. A carved ruby the size of a child's fist, worked with patterns that seemed to capture and reflect the hearth flames like a living heart. The heartstone of the Western Hoard, Runa realized. The single most valuable piece of the expedition's discoveries, and a symbol of everything that Magnus had died protecting. The wolf matriarch set the stone at Runa's feet. then fixed her amber gaze on Einar with an intensity that seemed to peer directly into his soul. The message was unmistakable. The choice between greed and wisdom, between taking and protecting, between destroying and preserving. Einar stared at the hearthstone, and Runa could see the war being fought behind his eyes. The same battle that Hakon had faced earlier, but intensified by violence and desperation to the point where reason barely retained its hold. The hearthstone lay between them like a test of character made manifest, its carved surface catching the firelight and throwing it back in patterns that seemed to pulse with living warmth. Around them the sounds of battle were fading as Einar's surviving men recognized that their cause was lost and began to withdraw into the darkness. Einar stared at the ruby with eyes that held 20 years of accumulated disappointment and desperation. His sword trembled in his grip, and Runa could see him calculating whether he could seize the stone and fight his way to freedom before the defenders could stop him. But the wolf matriarch had positioned herself perfectly, and her amber gaze held Einar's with patient, implacable wisdom. In that steady regard, he seemed to find something he had lost long ago, perhaps the memory of who he had been before greed had twisted his purposes, or perhaps simply the recognition that some battles could only be won by surrendering. His sword clattered to the floor as his knees gave way, and for the first time since entering the longhall, he looked like a man rather than a desperate animal driven by forces beyond his control. "I've spent so long taking things," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the hearth fire. "I don't remember how to do anything else." Runa knelt beside him, close enough that he could strike her if he chose, but confident in the judgment of the wolf whose wisdom had guided this night's events. "Learning to give instead of take doesn't require memory," she said gently. "It only requires choice." She lifted the hearthstone, feeling its weight not just in her hands, but in her understanding of what it represented. This wasn't just a valuable gem. It was a symbol of everything the Western expedition had accomplished, everything Magnus had protected, everything that could be lost if the wrong people gained control of the knowledge it represented. "This belongs to Gunnar and his companions," she continued, holding the stone so that its light fell across both their faces. "They earned it through sacrifice and wisdom, through building instead of destroying, through choosing to become part of something larger than themselves. But it also belongs to anyone who proves they understand the difference between treasure and legacy." Around them, the longhall was filling with people again, not warriors preparing for battle, but neighbors and allies gathering to witness the end of a long and difficult night. The strangers from the western lands moved among the villagers with quiet dignity, their presence transforming what might have been a scene of victory into something that felt more like a reunion. Hakon approached, carrying his father's shield, his expression showing the profound exhaustion of someone who had fought battles both external and internal. "The fires are out," he reported. "Most of Einar's men fled when they realized they were outnumbered and outmatched. Those who remained alive have agreed to accept safe passage in exchange for oaths not to return with hostile intent." Astrid moved between the wounded, offering aid with the practical competence of someone who had tended many injuries over her long life. Her herbal knowledge was being supplemented by techniques demonstrated by the Western visitors, creating an exchange of healing wisdom that seemed to embody everything Magnus had hoped to protect. As dawn light began to filter through the smoke holes in the roof, Runa found herself standing once again in the doorway of the longhall, but this time she wasn't alone. The wolf matriarch had produced a surprise during the night's events, a young pup who had been hidden somewhere safe while its mother participated in the defense of their territory. The pup was perhaps 3 months old, already showing the intelligence and bearing that marked its lineage, but still young enough to imprint on new guardians. It had taken an immediate liking to Runa, following her movements with bright amber eyes that held the promise of partnership rather than mere companionship. "Magnus told me this would happen," Ulf said, settling beside her on the hall steps. The old wolf pack's time was ending, but they had prepared for succession just as carefully as Magnus had. The matriarch chose you as worthy to guardian the next generation, both of wolves and of the knowledge they protect. Einar had spent the remaining hours of darkness in conversation with the Western visitors, learning about the civilization that Gunnar and his companions had joined. His expression had gradually shifted from desperation to wonder as he began to understand what true wealth looked like. Not gold that could be spent once and forgotten, but relationships that could benefit families for generations. "They've invited me to come west with them when they return," he said as the morning light strengthened. "Not as a raider or a treasure hunter, but as someone who might learn to contribute something worthwhile to what they're building." The hearthstone rested now in a place of honor above the hearth, its carved surface serving as a reminder of choices made and paths chosen. It would remain there as a symbol of everything Magnus had protected, but also as a beacon for others who might prove themselves worthy of sharing in the knowledge it represented. Hakon had made his own choice, using his father's shield to help repair the longhall's damaged walls, rather than to seek further conflict. His men had mostly chosen to accept employment as legitimate guards and workers rather than mercenaries, finding in honest labor a dignity that raid and pillage had never provided. As the sun climbed higher over the fjord, warming the faces of people who had survived a night that could have changed everything for the worse, Runa felt the weight of her inheritance settling into its proper place. She wasn't just the keeper of Magnus's secrets anymore. She was the guardian of a future that included multiple generations, multiple peoples, and possibilities that stretched beyond anything her uncle could have imagined when he first buried treasure beneath his hearth. The young wolf pup pressed against her leg, warm and solid and full of promise. Above them, its mother watched with the satisfaction of someone who had completed a sacred trust, passing the responsibility for protection from one generation to the next. In the distance, sails were visible on the fjord's waters, not raiders coming to take what they could carry, but traders bringing goods for honest exchange, drawn by word that Magnus's longhall was occupied again by people who understood the difference between wealth and wisdom. Runa smiled, feeling truly at peace for the first time in 20 years. She had found more than shelter in this inheritance. She had found purpose, community, and the chance to be part of something that would outlast any individual life. The legacy was secure, the future was promising, and the wolves would continue to guard both for as long as they were needed.